My name is Shaz Akram, and I'm the founder of HerPivot, an independent career mentorship organization that promotes stories of incredible women in the mid to executive level leadership role. HerPivot seeks to facilitate a platform for inspiring and empowering women, offering career advice, mentorship, and networking opportunities, advancing women's leadership. Listen to stories from professional women globally to make your pivot within limited professional opportunities. I'm delighted to be joined by Maryum Saifee, a Foreign Service Officer today. Maryum Saifee is an artist, activist, and a diplomat. Please notice activism and diplomacy. She's an incredible role model to be followed, especially if you're seeking to pivot in careers. Maryum Saifee is a career diplomat with overseas postings in Cairo, Erbil, Baghdad, and Lahore. She's currently serving in a newly launched bureau focused on advancing U.S. leadership in technology diplomacy. Prior to joining the State Department, Maryum worked at the Ford Foundation and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Jordan. She also worked with the South Asian survivors of domestic violence as an AmeriCorps volunteer in Seattle. Saifee is a graduate of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us. She is participating in this interview in her personal capacity, and her views do not necessarily reflect her institutional affiliations. So, Maryum, what inspires you to work in this industry, a difficult one?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is wonderful. It's wonderful to be here. It's a great question. What inspired me? I think, I really stumbled into this career in the Foreign Service. So it wasn't my life dream when I was young to become a diplomat. I don't think I really understood what diplomacy really meant. I was born and raised in Texas. So I, didn't have a lot of role models in this field. And so for me, I think what my pivot was when I joined the Peace Corps in Jordan. And I was a 19-year-old, young, fresh out of college, started college really early. And my parents had been sort of pressuring me, to stick to careers that are safe, like medicine or engineering, or, where I could sort of keep my head down and not necessarily be too sort of politically engaged. And then I grew up in that shadow of September the 11th. And so the community, my community, Muslim communities, and even just broader communities who look like me, South Asian, Sikh, Hindu, immigrant communities were really under attack. And so after the Peace Corps, I did AmeriCorps, like you mentioned, working with survivors of domestic violence from South Asian communities, but also folks who were dealing with the backlash of post-September the 11th, and especially the Sikh community in Seattle in particular. So that made me sort of interested in the world. And Peace Corps is sort of what made me interested in maybe living overseas. And I remember visiting the U.S. ambassador at the time. It was Bill Burns. He invited us for July 4th for this, barbecue. And we all I remember we were so excited there was real ketchup because the ketchup came from the commissary. So we were putting ketchup in our pockets, just we were all excited. And I remember we weren't invited back again. So maybe because we were overly excited. But I was like, this place is interesting. What is this embassy? What does this person do? Seems like they do more than renew passports. It seems like they do other things. And so fast forward years later, I went to graduate school at Columbia, studied international affairs, studied labor migration in the Middle East in particular. Thought I would do journalism actually. So I thought, this is what I want to do. Then turned out that, the industry was collapsing when I graduated. And my parents said, we don't know what you're doing. You've gone to the Peace Corps, you've done AmeriCorps. What are all these corps? We don't understand any of this. And just get a job. And so then I had taken the Foreign Service exam really just for fun. I was like, it's a multiple choice test. It's sort of like a curiosity. They ask questions on geography and, politics and different things, languages. So I thought this might just be fun to take. I'm not going to actually do this as a career because I felt like it would be too rigid for me. I wanted something more creative and more, where I could be more of have a personal voice, an advocacy voice, because I cared a lot about human rights issues, especially in the Middle East. So I ended up, stumbling into the State Department because had no other options. I passed the exam, frantically looked for other jobs. At the time I was working at the Ford Foundation, loved it, but knew that my time was limited because the financial crisis hit. And so then basically my parents, they're like, if you have no other options, this seems like the only one. And so I decided, let me just do this for a few years. Few years turned into the last, decade plus. And so it's been such an interesting career. And so I think my takeaway from that experience is that you can come in with the best plans, but life kind of just has a way of unfolding in front of you, and to just embrace some of the serendipity of what comes, and to not be overly scripted. I think I came in with a very distinct plan, and I'm really grateful nothing went according to plan.
But you're also, did your activism start prior to you joining the Foreign Service, or were you always an activist as you were growing up?
I think my activism probably started more, or my curiosity started in Peace Corps when I was in Jordan, because the first time I had sort of really, lived in the region, I had ideas about the region, but didn't really know much, and so living in a village in Jordan, getting to know neighbors, like learning the language from scratch, I sort of became really interested in how the media was portraying the Middle East, Israel, issues with Palestinians, Jordan, Iraq, Iran. Like I was sort of curious about that. And I think when I was in graduate school, I became much more of an activist, especially around human rights issues in the region. And an area that I found to be completely underfocused was the migration of domestic workers, South Asian, largely South Asian and Southeast Asian, Indonesian, Filipina, and Sri Lankan domestic workers to labor importing Arab states, who their passports are confiscated often upon arrival. They have a system called the kafala system. And so they are really vulnerable and kind of invisible, right? They're outside the formal labor economy. So that became my focus in graduate school, and sort of helping people understand this issue even exists, even within human rights communities that already were quite established, became something that really interested in me. And in graduate school at Columbia is where I took journalism courses and sort of found my voice, I would say, because I learned how to write, I learned how to become an advocate. And I think that carried through even in my State Department career now, where you do advocacy internally. You may not necessarily be able to speak very publicly about the work you're doing, but it gave me that it built a muscle inside me, I think, when I was in grad school. And I always thought I would just be working for human rights organizations. I wouldn't be doing advocacy work within the diplomatic corps. But I've learned in a surprising way that it's very much possible.
In what ways is your profession changing? It is a tough field. It's a new field. Many women don't know about this field. So it would be great if you could just sort of share how the field is changing.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a kind of a timely one, because the State Department, in particular my profession, the Foreign Service, is celebrating in 2024, this year, its 100-year anniversary of existence. So I've been reflecting a lot amongst many colleagues of mine on sort of the Foreign Service of the past and the Foreign Service that we'd like to see for the future. And so I think we're really at an inflection point, because the demographics of our country are shifting. And as a result, there's really a recognized need for making sure that our diplomatic corps reflects the diversity. And this is across, demography, but also geography across the country, so that it becomes more reflective of the country we actually serve. So we're building a more representative, diplomatic corps. The secretary that we currently have, Secretary Blinken, is seized with this issue and wants to make these sort of changes. And so that's been promising to see that there's the past was very much, largely white, largely male, what they called pale male in Yale. I'd say, most of the folks who come through tend to be from, Georgetown School of Foreign Service, or, sort of this within the Beltway even, so geographically. And so that I think is starting to shift, which is a positive sign. I think one of the challenges is we're recruiting more diverse types of people, but retaining them is another issue, right? So that's another part of this equation, is how do you create an institution where employees, regardless of where they come from, feel like they can contribute, feel safe, both physically, psychologically, et cetera. The other big thing, and this has been exciting for me working in the bureau that I'm currently in, which is focused on integrating technology into pretty much every aspect of our foreign policy, is that we're in the midst of a technological revolution with the rise of generative artificial intelligence. And so it's pretty, head spinning to be in this space at the moment because diplomacy and policy tends to be quite slow, right? The formulation and technology, especially the rate with generative AI, it's rapidly changing. And so how do you bridge this disconnect between, the slow moving policy formulation, especially not just on the domestic front, but the global, the multilateral, the United Nations, like that's not known to be lightning speed in terms of, how things move. So we're trying to figure out how do we move diplomacy at the speed of technology. And I think it's really a fascinating time to be in this profession in this moment, because what I'm seeing is a lot of these silos that have existed for decades since maybe the formation of the State Department, they're starting to break down, right? So like the way technology intersects, it's not just the Technology Bureau, it's climate technology. How is technology solving massive foreign policy challenges? How is technology advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, right? So it's a pretty interesting moment, I think, in terms of the makeup of the workforce that's changing, but also the way we're conducting diplomacy because of this technological revolution is also changing how, it's rewiring the way the institution is structured.
So is the State Department hiring more women in security and in technology and like in cybersecurity fields?
So yeah, I think the answer is they're doing much more sophisticated outreach to make sure that our selection, or the pools of people coming in, are coming from as many backgrounds as possible. One big thing that we were working on in an office I used to work in, focused on diversity and inclusion, which is another startup within the State Department, was letting people know that you don't need a college degree to join the State Department, right? You don't need a college degree to be a diplomat. So we would go to community colleges. We would go outside of the DC area or the sort of New York area and go to, Idaho, or go to, places outside of the usual. And I think that ends up kind of building more bridges across the country, and also making sure women feel like they're part of, I think it's women, it's underrepresented groups, and really defining diversity quite broadly. So we're not only talking about demography, we're talking about people of, first generation immigrants, first generation college students. So people of, different, socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I think it's really important we have a very inclusive lens when it comes to defining, diversifying our diplomatic corps.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of recruitment going on for women in security.
Yep.
Generally, because security details at embassies, the Secret Service,
Yep.
more women are being encouraged to apply and join those fields. So I've seen that.
Yes.
There was just a conference on women in security at the World Bank,
Yep.
where there was all this discussion how difficult it is for women to actually serve.
Yeah.
But it's good to hear that the technology and cybersecurity field is opening up as well for more representation.
I'd say it's not, it still has a ways to go. I wouldn't say we've reached gender parity in the fields of diplomacy or the fields of, technology. And those two fields intersecting, there's still room for improvement. So I think, the more we can kind of build more pipelines into the State Department and into the tech sector, and now we're in this blended environment of technology diplomacy, which is sort of new. Like the term itself is brand new. People are asking, what does that mean? And it's a really holistic approach to, it's looking at cybersecurity, but it's also looking at human rights issues. It's looking at countering disinformation, countering, surveillance, the misuse of technologies, mitigating algorithmic bias, because bias, including gender bias, can be baked into data sets, which can exacerbate some of the inequities that are in let's say hiring, for example, or even housing, sort of benefits, and also connectivity, just bridging digital divides, and that includes bridging the gender digital divide as well.
Excellent. So, but how did you first become interested in this field?
So I'd say for diplomacy, I sort of, as I said, stumbled into it, was really curious about the world, and the thing I love about the State Department and the Foreign Service in particular is it's this career reinvention. So every couple of years you get to do something completely new. So I started in Cairo in 2011. I got there actually in 2009 and then overlapped with the revolution happening. Had no idea that was going to happen. So I was doing cultural exchange programs, managing and interviewing people for the Fulbright program, which I know you're familiar with, and dozens of other exchange programs. And so really got to know Egyptians from all different backgrounds. And when I was in Baghdad, then I worked on special immigrant visas. So every couple of years, it's working on refugee issues in one assignment, and then in Pakistan in Lahore, I was the spokesperson for our consulate. So dealing with journalists and creating press guidance, and so now stumbled into this technology field, and so. The fun part of it is that you're never bored. Like you're always learning. I think it's a great career if you have endless curiosity, and also humility, I think, is necessary, and a growth mindset where you're constantly wanting to learn.
So I'm a candidate for the Fulbright Specialist Program, and I am going to go to Pakistan.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
College for 6 weeks.
Oh my God, that's
And one of them is to teach about disinformation.
That's awesome.
And AI and ChatGPT as
that is
learning
wonderful.
tools.
Yeah.
For classroom instruction. So let's see where that goes.
Yeah,
I will be following up with you on questions about that.
And I will learn from you, actually. That's awesome.
It's going to be a first, and I'm looking forward to it. So, Maryum, given your experience, how do you think the State Department is doing in advancing a more inclusive workplace?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's a work in progress, and it's important to note. In my personal capacity, I led a task force on State Department reform with the Truman Center for National Policy, and so I left government. I'd taken a break and was sort of recruited to help. First assemble the task force. So there were 30 of us. I made sure half were civil service, half were foreign service. So there was some, equity of perspective, because it's different for foreign service officers than it is for our civil service counterparts. So that was one piece of it. But it became this sort of incubator of, how can we build an institution that we can really transform an institution into a place that everyone just can realize their full potential. It was like a very basic, premise. And the roadmap to that was, having, first it was just establishing trust, right? That was sort of the baseline. So this happened, we were doing it during the last administration. And so there was a lot of, turbulence, I'd say. And so I think, but what we noted was that, these issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, however you want to call it, they go back to the beginnings of the State Department, right? It's sort of baked into the DNA of the institution itself. So how do we restore trust by acknowledging that there have been, past, inequities that are things that we need to look at, like assignment restrictions, for example. Are certain groups from demographic backgrounds restricted from serving in places? Is it fair? Does it make sense? Looking at promotions, are there certain groups that are lagging behind? There was a very powerful statistic in, I think it was the 2020 Government Accountability Office report, saying I think it was in 2002, the number of Black women in the Foreign Service was at 2%. And in 2017, and this predates the Trump administration, in 2017, it only went up to 3%, right? So that's compared to the demographics of the country, pretty low representation. And so one of the big pushes that we called for was to disaggregate data. So the demographic data, it's not only looking at race, it's looking at gender, ethnicity, disability status, and then seeing, what is the baseline? Like where are people at based on their career path? Are all of the women of color ranked at the lowest levels, or is it more evenly spread out? We don't know, right? So unless you measure it, you're not going to know. Mm-hmm. So that's one really positive thing that has happened in this administration, is that for the first time ever, there's a demographic baseline report that not only is released to the workforce, but to the general public, which I think is incredibly important for transparency. So I say that's a huge step in the right direction. In terms of accountability, I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. Do people feel safe, right? Because trust, again, is foundational for any diversity and inclusion effort to succeed. Because if people are scared to talk, you're not going to reap the benefits of diversity of thought, right? So I think the accountability piece is something that is still a work in progress in my institution, I imagine in others as well. How do you hold toxic leadership to account? If you're not doing anything, then what happens is people, really smart, talented, brilliant people of all backgrounds, they just leave. And so we have an attrition issue where people then, and especially now because of the tech sector is very interested in our policy knowledge. So a lot of them are going into, much more lucrative professions because they just want to be treated better.
Yeah, I mean, in this administration, to this administration's credit, they've hired the most and appointed the most women of color in different offices. So that's a good thing.
Right.
But, let's see what.
Right. And what I would say is
future brings.
it's not so much about, yes, you want the demographic representation in the senior ranks, but it's also the kinds of people you're bringing in, right? So you want people who are going to be courageous, right? If they see something not okay, they're going to speak up and do something. So really it's about creating a culture of accountability and recruiting the kinds of people, whatever background they are actually, that are going to make the institution much more equitable and really just a kinder place to be. Because if you bring in and recruit people just because they're of a certain background, they may not be good managers, and so it's really important to think through, who are you bringing in? What kind of candidates? How are you making sure that they're people who will really empower and lead by example? And especially around creating a workplace where people can thrive.
And especially women, as they are chosen and selected, there should be some criteria of mentorship.
Right.
They pull each other up.
Right.
Women, I'm sure a lot of other people's experience, particularly mine personally, have not been the best mentors for me.
Right.
As I've navigated from career to career. Which is one of the reasons I started HerPivot, was that I wanted resources for women that were free, accessible, and easy to understand how other women successfully change careers at later stages in their life or make different types of career-related decisions, even leaving a job and starting their own work. But mentorship is crucial, and
absolutely.
Mentorship of women, pulling one another up, is more crucial than men mentoring other women. So let's we'll keep going with other questions. Thanks for that. Now we're coming to the mentoring advice section of our conversation. And thank you, Maryum, for your really thoughtful and deep answers. Is there anyone who inspired you and made you who you are today?
So I think, one mentor I'd say of mine is someone I've never met, Ambassador Terrence Todman. So it's somebody who I read about in a New York Times op-ed written by a really good friend of mine, Chris Richardson, who had left the State Department, another talented Foreign Service officer who left. And he wrote about the State Department and how a lot of these, structural inequities were sort of baked in from the beginning. And he tells the story of Ambassador Todman, who came from the Virgin Islands in the 1950s to enroll in language class, right, as an entry-level diplomat, just like I did, over a decade ago. And he comes to the cafeteria to eat lunch and notices that he's not allowed to eat lunch because it's segregated. This is during Jim Crow. So he, has the courage and the wherewithal, even as an entry-level, Foreign Service officer, to say, hey, how am I supposed to represent my country overseas when I can't even eat with my colleagues? Like, this doesn't make any sense. So it took a while, and eventually the dining facilities that the department was leasing were desegregated, and so that was sort of the beginning of his career. And what made it really interesting for me, his career, and what inspires me, is that he stayed true to his North Star, right? His integrity. He just kept it intact, right? No matter, he ended up serving 40 years under 9 presidential administrations, had the second highest number of ambassadorial appointments in U.S. history. So not as a black man, it's of all time, right? Like he had the second highest number. And so you think about his career coming from, and it wasn't just, the beginning of his career, it was throughout his career, this moral compass that he had, this North Star. He even said this, like, people thought I was a troublemaker and that was all right. Like he self-identified as a troublemaker in a good way. And one of the, in the 1980s when there was apartheid in South Africa, he was one of the few black diplomats. And so, at the time we were supporting apartheid. And this was during the Reagan administration. So then Secretary Schultz, taps Taubman on the shoulder to say, hey, I want to send you to become ambassador to South Africa. And he basically says, I don't know what he exactly said, but paraphrasing, I'm not going to be the black face of apartheid, so no. And you don't do that, right? Is it like if somebody said, hey, Maryum, you're going to be ambassador to XYZ, you're like, thank you so much for this honor, and that's it. You don't really push back. And I thought, throughout his career, he just kept doing this over and over again. And I sort of wondered, like, how did this guy do it? There was a huge cost. I mean, when he was, said no to the ambassadorship in South Africa, he had kids. He had, to support, I think at the time maybe 3 or 4 children. His wife, his family. He was really good at languages and all these other things. How transferable is that as a career? I mean, in the 1980s as a black man in America. So thinking about the way he was able to navigate and really the courage he had, knowing that the costs were just really high, it serves for me as an inspiration in any of the work I do. I think, what would Taubman do in this moment? And I'm lucky enough to live actually not, probably 20 blocks north of his son. So his son has become a mentor of mine. And I'm so grateful. Like this New York Times op-ed, I stumbled into learning about his story. We named the cafeteria. I led an effort alongside 2 other colleagues to name the cafeteria in honor of Ambassador Taubman. And when I go to the cafeteria, even though I'm based out of New York and I visit DC, we are always conspiring in that cafeteria. I was noticing, like other colleagues were like, we're going to meet in the Taubman cafeteria and we're looking, how do we reform this? How do we do this? And so it's just one of the most, it's just a gift, stumbling into that op-ed, learning about Ambassador Taubman and getting to know his family. It's been beautiful.
And then naming the cafeteria after him and still using his name to keep doing the things that he...
Yeah, we call ourselves Team Taubman. It's like...
that he aspired to do and did for change, positive change. You are an artist also, and a pretty excellent artist, if I may say so. But the role models you've used in your art, I've noticed you've used Ruth Ginsburg, and then you have some religious icons, and I don't see any male influence in the art.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one.
I just wanted to ask you about that.
No, it's a great question, and it's an interesting one because I hadn't thought of it. During the pandemic, I was just sort of, as many were, like you can't leave or easily, get out. And so I ended up painting. I love painting. I've always painted, but never had to stop doing it because of how hectic the career, had been, and especially Baghdad. And I remember bringing like 20 blank canvases to Baghdad and packed 20 blank canvases back because it was just too stressful. Like I thought I would be able to have all this extra time, and ended up being almost almost traumatized by the experience in some ways. So those canvases, actually, I started to paint finally during the pandemic. And I did a series of women who were just really inspiring to me. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of them. I painted that portrait when I found out she died. I was just sort of overwhelmed by it. A mentor of mine in undergrad, actually, I think the reason I ended up really pivoting my whole career was Sarah Weddington, who was the attorney who argued Roe versus Wade successfully. She was only in her 20s when she did it. And she sort of guided me throughout my career. She was the first person who asked me, and I'll never forget it, because I told her, I think I was like 17. I mean, I started college quite young. And so I remember telling her, like, you're famous and I want to go to a really fancy med school. So I'm in your class because I want you to write me a fancy letter of recommendation. And she was just like, it was so blunt and ridiculous. I can't even imagine approaching anyone saying that. I would like slam the door in their face. And instead, Sarah looked at me and she was like, wow, you have such plans. They're so fixed. And I wonder, like, is this what you want to do? And then I just remember her say, I was like, no one's ever asked me that question before. Like, it was like completely, and I remember she planted the seed. And so that's what inspired me to delay, applying to med school because I was so young anyway, that my parents said, okay, fine, take a few years to think about things, but the pathway is already scripted. And I remember Sarah's voice in my head because she was like, yeah, that Peace Corps sounds fun. I was like, okay, I'll do the Peace Corps, then AmeriCorps, then grad school and beyond, right? And then the Foreign Service. So she was sort of the inspiration for that. And I thought about her as well, Sarah, and I thought about and Sarah Weddington also passed away recently. And so these icons, I was just, thinking about how do you capture their essence? And it just helped me to heal, I think, from hearing about, RBG, as she's known by the three letters. And then also like Shirley Chisholm, was another one that I painted because I just thought about her, unbought and unbossed. Like what an amazing slogan. It was kind of, she was so unapologetic. She was so comfortable in her own skin. This short woman, from, immigrant coming, from the Caribbean coming to the United States and breaking all these barriers, just extraordinary. And I have her picture, this very lovely like hair that's like, almost as big as she is. And in the inscription I wrote like something that's a proverb in Shia Islam: be like the flower that remains fragrant even if the hand is crushing it.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of the sort of idea of like, how do you build resilience and rise above, right? This kind of, and so I thought of her and so, yeah, it was a really like beautiful, I want to get back into painting, but you've reminded me, I mean, it was such an amazing like healing journey for me to paint and to kind of bring to life. Noor Jahan was another one because when I was reading about her, when I was posted in Lahore, I actually visited her tomb. Even though
Noor
it was
Jahan, the
Noor Jahan,
Mughal queen,
the queen, not the singer,
Yes.
who's also quite famous, very famous. But Noor Jahan's tomb in Lahore is pretty much desolate, right? And I went there kind of almost on a pilgrimage just to see her tomb, thinking it was going to be as extraordinary as Jahangir, her husband. She was a co-ruler to Jahangir, and she's actually the person who her father. She originally came from Isfahan, from Iran, and her father, she was building a tomb for him, and that became the precursor to the Taj Mahal, the tomb of Itimad ad-Dawla, which is her father. And so she was someone who, again, was like brought like the greatest sort of jewel to the subcontinent from her roots in Iran, the style of architecture with the four gardens, like all of that. And, she's another one of these women in history that's just sort of extraordinary. So there's all of this like history that kind of inspires women, men, people, just people with courage, people with integrity that are really kind of, pushing for a better world for others and lifting the weight off of the shoulders of others. And I think that's been a common theme. And for me, it doesn't actually matter if it's a woman that's a mentor or a man or anyone in between. It doesn't matter. I think it's just the content of who they are is everything.
Yeah. No, well said, well said. So what is the best piece of advice you have received?
The best piece of advice, I heard this from, and I don't know from, but well, actually, an ambassador of mine had said this, and I don't know where he got it from, but it's that you can only move at the speed of trust. And I love that phrase because trust is so foundational to everything, in terms of our diplomacy, if we're not leading by example, if we're, advocating for one thing, but we're not following through in our own policies, it breaks down trust, right? And then you really can't be effective. And in our personal relationships, I feel the same way. If you, as a manager, if you're rising up the ranks in the mid-career to the senior ranks, I think building trust along the way, the people that you mentor, making sure that those relationships are sacred, those friendships are sacred. My best mentors are people who I just know they have my back. Like they don't just care about my career, they just care about me as a person. So if I'm, struggling or if I'm, you have moments where you're just exhausted. Like the career is exhausting. You're in Baghdad. You're feeling isolated. And so finding your tribe, I think that's really what it is. It's like you need to build trust and you need to find your tribe. And another piece of advice, and this is I can attribute to Ambassador Aurelia Brazil, who's extraordinary, another groundbreaking diplomat, and she said something really that has stuck with me as well. The currency of diplomacy is optimism. And it's a beautiful quote because there's moments of such darkness that you're like, how can I even, like, what's the point? Like, let's just shut everything down. It's like, it's nothing is working. And I think you still have to have hope. You still have to keep pushing, chipping away, pushing for reforms, using your voice at the table, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Especially many of us are still the only people who look like us in a room. And I think it's important to use your voice in those spaces, right? It's not enough to just be present. Yes, we have a lot of representation, maybe political appointees in this administration that are from different backgrounds, but that's not success. The success is if they're at the table, they're allowed to contribute, meaningfully contribute, and really be part of the conversation and shape policy, and that dissenting voices are also really encouraged, in the policymaking process. The dissent might not translate into the policy necessarily, but having those spaces for candor, having those spaces where you can be curious and you can ask questions and still be respected, right, by your colleagues, I think is so critical. And all of that, again, trust is foundational to building an environment where you can be courageous, where you can be your authentic self, and you can share the diverse perspectives and lived experiences where you come from.
Oh, thank you. So this is our last question of the conversation.
Okay.
But what resources would you advise women looking to grow, transition, or change career pathways to seek out? Networking with certain organizations, certain kinds of funding, finances, financing, or even attitude, right?
Yeah, I think it's
mindset.
It's a great question. I think, find people who inspire you and just, grab 20 minutes with them, have a coffee with them, just hear about their stories, and I've gone down so many rabbit holes of just like Ambassador Todman's story. I've just become obsessed with it. And I found others, Archer Blood, who was the architect of our descent cable, who sounded the alarm bells to a humanitarian catastrophe happening in what was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh in 1971. These are just, find your kind of role models, even if they're in history. They can be in history books, but sort of figure out who you are and how you're connected to others. I think is one piece of it, and sort of building your tribe, which is what I mentioned before. The other is depends on the sector, but if you're interested in foreign policy work, the Council on Foreign Relations is an excellent place to, even if you're not a member, you can join as a member, which is great. But their website has almost all of their programming is now, because of post-pandemic, it's all recorded. So you can listen to these videos on pretty much everything under the sun and just get smart on things and go outside your comfort zone. So don't necessarily it's like I study XYZ part of the world. I'm, a specialist in, let's say, Sub-Saharan Africa. Like, look at what's happening in, the Pacific Ocean, or in South America or whatnot, and different topics. And so I think the more well-rounded you are, I think it's a strength. You should specialize. You should talk to colleagues in your field, but also talk to folks outside of your field. Largely because the world is becoming so much more. Those silos are breaking down more than ever. So I think it's important to also be both a generalist and a specialist.
So that's very good advice. And I would say mentorship is key, networking is key, and then just listening and attending events of topics of interest, your field. I would say be true to yourself, like you've already pointed out. Trust in yourself. Imposter syndrome, in my opinion, is a fake word created to create confusion in women's minds, or even men. Men suffer from imposter syndrome as well. That goes away as soon as you start believing in yourself. So mentorship is key, networking is key, and follow and listen to women that you really aspire to be like.
Women and men.
And men also, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to focus on the fact that we have to pull each other up, right?
I think
have
we
to pull
do,
each
but I
other
think
up.
I agree. I agree. I think with mentorship, I think having a diverse set of mentors, like, so I think
Is key.
it's
right.
women that are, and men who are, more senior than you, even junior than you. Like, I mean, there's like learning from people who are in different, stages of life. I think it can be mentorship is a 360-degree, and the more diverse the types of people you are that you're drawing inspiration from, I think the more like fulfilling it is, I think, the experience. And the other piece is it can be situational. So for me, it's, I don't like, I for the first time I'm in a formal mentorship program at State Department, which has been great. And the person that they've assigned me to randomly is someone I never would have met otherwise. He's wonderful, and he focuses on digital economy issues, which I don't know very much about. And then I was assigned to mentor a younger graduate student at Columbia, where I went to graduate school. And so it's been fun for me to be wearing the hat of the mentor and the mentee. And for me, I think it can be formalized, but it also can just be informal. Sometimes it's situational. It's figuring out, but the biggest piece of advice is make sure when you are engaging with a mentor or you're mentoring, the time is so sacred. So just to kind of be very intentional with what your goals are. It doesn't have to be overly scripted, but have some sort of idea of what you're hoping for. And I think that is something really can be valuable in the experience.
Well, Maryum, thank you so much for joining me today for
thank
the
you.
conversation. We will have the video available on HerPivot. Please follow us and do visit Maryum's website and follow the work she does. It's an incredible testament to where her heart is and where her mind is also. So we look forward to future conversations. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This was fun. Thank you.